The following is a conversation with Scott Santens. Scott is somebody who has done a lot of economic research, both into what it is that makes our financial system the way it is today and what it would mean if we implement universal basic income. Artificial intelligence is sometimes described as man's last invention, the invention that can invent for us better than we could ever invent in the first place. That means there's going to be a whole lot of wealth, a whole lot of job displacements, and really just a very different future. And maybe the economic system we have now isn't the best one for that, or maybe it is. Let's dive in.
When it comes to the definition of a basic income, there are a few key aspects of it for people to understand. And so that this is a cash payment that is unconditional, universal, regularly provided to individuals. So it needs to meet each of those 5 characteristics to be called a basic income. And an example of a basic income in existence, the Alaska dividend. And so that's, a lot of people don't know this, but people in Alaska have received a dividend every year since 1982. So for 40 years now. And that meets the definition for basic income because it goes to everybody in Alaska, rich or poor, young or old even. Everyone gets the same amount. And there are no work requirements to receive it. That's the unconditional aspect of it. Effective way to think about this is basic income is about the payment itself. So what qualifies as a basic income is purely just the payment. Now, there's a lot of different ways of funding a basic income. There's a lot of different mechanisms that can go along with it. There's a lot of different ways to shape it. When it comes to the Alaska dividend, you could see that as being a tax on oil companies. And so if we're talking about a basic income and we're even talking about this from the aspect of, say, automation, then you can say, well, it makes sense to tax the technology companies. Like it makes sense to tax AI and robots. And in which case, that's where the money comes from. Not necessarily rich people, but rich people will be the ones mostly benefiting from automation. Yeah, there's just a lot of different ways of implementing a basic income through the different taxation options that I think would make more sense to also reform when it comes to basic income. So those are just some existing things that we can shape differently, use that for the basic income. But then when it comes to taxes, I do have my preferences for that. And I'd start out by saying that I don't think that income taxes make the most sense for this, especially as we go towards a more automated society where a lot of this is more capital instead of labor. So why would we want to tax labor if a lot of more of this is just capital?
Yeah, that's a big distinction because I guess, just being kind of naive to how the system works, my first thought was like, oh, I hope they don't raise my tax. I have this thought that the way welfare works is when you're like kind of low, you don't have a job prospect right now. So the government's giving you say like $600 or $800 a month so you can pay for some food and rent. And then if you are offered a job, say something at McDonald's that pays very low, you kind of have to transfer off of that payment to now receive your new one. So in theory, if you were making $800 from the government and you take a job for $1,500, you're only now getting the difference. You've lost that other income. So it truly seems misaligned in my mind because now you're actually really making it hard for somebody to go get a job and give up on that extra money. Whereas if it was $800 baseline, no matter what, the job's just extra money. Is that kind of how it works? And does that feel broken to you in the same way it does to me? Or is there more to that story?
Oh, absolutely. It's called the welfare cliff, welfare trap, poverty trap. There's a lot of different ways to refer to this. And I think it's actually really important for people to understand. And this actually gets into how people will first hear about basic income and they'll say something like, oh, you mean like paying people to do nothing? No. Basic income is paying you to do anything, not nothing. And there's a distinction to make there because the existing conditional welfare system says, as you said, let's say you need to keep your income below a certain level. So let's say you do not get anything unless your income falls below $1,200 per month, in which case you need to make sure that your income stays below $1,200 a month unless you want to lose that. And so it makes it so that it only makes sense to accept a job if that job pays a lot more to make up for the loss of what you lose. What it gets down to is essentially marginal tax rates. And I think this is easier for conservatives to understand. What is the incentive that you provide someone when you tax them at an 80% tax rate? 80 cents per dollar. And no one in the country sees tax rates that high, no matter how rich they are. The people who were taxing the most are the ones who are actually on these programs because they see these high marginal tax rates. Basic income doesn't have that. You always are better off accepting any amount of money through any amount of work because of the fact that you do not lose it regardless of how much work you do. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense to do universal basic income instead, and to make sure that you replace some of those programs at least, because then you lose that marginal tax rate.
That's really interesting. Even though I did have that thought before this interview, I've never thought of it as somebody who is on welfare switching off of it, having a 50, 60%, maybe even up to 80% tax rate. It's just the same concept, but thought of differently.
How people will think a guaranteed minimum income is the same thing as a universal basic income. People can think that, oh, they sound similar, so they're the same thing, right? A guaranteed minimum income actually commonly has a 100% tax rate. And so this is, if you fall below the line, if you are below $1,200, then it lifts you up to that point. And so just imagine if you're at $0 and you're at $1 below that line, regardless of that, you get up to that line. So there's no reason at all with a 100% tax rate to do anything. And that's a very different thing. So even when like a country will celebrate this and say, oh, Italy just passed a guaranteed minimum income. And then maybe the press looks at that and goes, oh, wow, Italy has a basic income. And no, it's not at all the same. Guaranteed minimum income has been around for a very long time. And that's what it involves with these huge tax rates. And what's different about universal basic income is that you don't see those phase out rates that are massively high.
It's interesting. A lot of these problems are just deep in the system. The concept of social justice and equality and UBI, how do you sort of see the fairness or unfairness of these systems?
I think that one of the more powerful kind of philosophical justifications for basic income, say originally stated by Thomas Paine. And so this has been around for a very long time. Now, Thomas Paine wasn't talking about a universal basic income, but the logic is still the same. Thomas Paine, this is late 1700s, one of our founding fathers, he wrote something called Agrarian Justice. And in this, he proposed that everyone upon reaching the age of 21 receives the same amount of capital grant. And so imagine, I don't know what the equivalent would be today right now, but let's say upon reaching age 21 today, you would receive $20,000. And this is everybody, rich or poor, working, non-working, there's no work requirement. Everybody gets this upon turning 21. And his justification for this, prior to civilization, everyone was on, there was a certain amount of, say, I don't know, natural poverty. There was an amount of work that you needed to do. You need to go hunt and forage for food. The resources themselves were free. And it just required the effort in order to, say, feed yourself and house yourself using Earth's natural resources. Okay. And then we started civilization, we started the property system, and we enclosed these areas. And basically, we put a price on these resources. And by doing that, we actually left people, at least some people, worse off than they would have been in the state of nature. Now, as a part of that deal, we actually created a lot of great things, you know, a lot of wealth, a lot of technology, a lot of these things that we do want. But in the process of making things better for a lot of people, we also made things worse for some people. And we did that by, he described it as the dispossession of natural inheritance, where the earth belongs to everybody. And if you are to use a piece of the earth, then you should benefit from the value that you add to it, but you shouldn't own this piece of the earth that someone else could have used too. And so you owe it, he called it a form of ground rent to everybody else. If we did that, if we recognized that and said, look, and this is also what I would say that Alaska, the dividend works. It says, you know, nobody created the oil in Alaska. And so everybody should benefit from that natural resource. And if you look at all the natural resources in existence, all the different minerals, all the different land itself, then who should benefit from that? And I think that we all should. And universal basic income says that we all should benefit from that.
For artificial intelligence, it's becoming one of those questions where it doesn't feel like an invention anymore when you develop the kind of technology that invents its own inventions. When it becomes something that's more universal to intelligence, how do you just say, oh, Google came up with that and now they own it? And if it's going to create these economic resources in all these other parts of the world, maybe we could think of intelligence maybe a little bit more like oil, something that was bestowed to the whole planet before us, and we just picked up some of it. But there's plenty more out there for us to harness.
And I think technology is a technological inheritance. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. And this is decades of technological development passed down generation after generation. Each generation builds on what the previous generation built. Who should benefit at the peak of this, where we create highly automated technologies? Should one person essentially benefit from everything from previous generations past? Or should it be that we should see this as some kind of inheritance where at least some of that we should all equally inherit?
So have you looked into the economic impacts of what UBI kind of seems to do for Alaska versus what it might do if it was implemented in other parts of the world?
There's a 17% increase in part-time employment in Alaska, and there's been no increase or decrease in full-time employment. A study that looked into this concluded that when it comes to full-time employment, there was a slight decrease in full-time employment for people having the extra money. Then people spending the money created demand for new jobs, and then those jobs were taken by the people who wanted those jobs, and so then there was essentially a neutral effect on full-time employment. But then when it came to part-time employment, there was this increase. It's the spending of it that really creates jobs that I think people discount. One of my favorite stories is from the Namibia UBI pilot. One of the women in the village, on her first payment, she went out and bought a bunch of stuff to create her own business, baking goods for her village. And as a result of that, she actually ended up earning, I think it was 4 times the amount of the basic income on top of her basic income from her successful business. Her business became the biggest success of the whole village, a whole new business that only happened because of that. People might look at that and think, she was an entrepreneur. She had, the gumption to do this, and she just needed access to capital, which basic income functioned as. And that's true, that aspect of it is true. But the thing is, if you compare what happened there to, let's say, if you gave that same person a loan or even an entrepreneurial grant, the thing is that UBI provided every single person in her village the ability to be her customer. And if she had opened up that business without that money, then would have she have succeeded? Probably not. And so then if you think about it from that perspective, how many businesses have shut down? Not because they weren't
the customers didn't have the money.
Good or service. Right. It was because they didn't have customers with the extra money to spend to be customers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. A couple of years ago, I started reading some financial books. One little nugget that just stuck in my head was the idea that some countries that had looser bankruptcy laws also seem to have more innovation. If you can actually try to build something and then you're forgiven and you can restart again, part of successful businesses require some trial and error and learning and sort of loss. How does UBI maybe fit into that kind of a concept?
Yeah, there's so many people out there with ideas, and there's a danger of doing that, especially if you have a family. I could do this safe job and I know I can get this typical wage, but if I start something, I'm going to have to put up some capital, I'll have to get a loan, and then maybe I'll have to put my house up as part of the loan. It's really scary. What happens to me if this failed, and will I fall into poverty, and what does that mean for me? And if you have a family, it's what if I bring my whole family into poverty? But with basic income, because you know for sure that no matter what happens, you're not going to fall below the level of basic income, then you just see a lot more people taking those risks. And not only is that theoretically understandable, but it's also observed over and over.
How would you determine the right amount of money to give to UBI, and what factors would you put on that? Would you do it by state or by personal income, or would you just blanket across? What are the kind of factors that go into that?
I think it's important that it's actually fully universal and the same everywhere. Social Security doesn't adjust by region. Regions are entirely capable of boosting the basic income with their own supplements. State level boosts for the earned income tax credit, there's state level boosts for the EITC, there's state level boosts for SSI. I think it's really important to be fully universal across the country at any amount. The incentive structure that if you are in a more expensive place, then there's actually an incentive to go somewhere where your money will go further. Housing is so expensive in densely populated areas because that's where the jobs are. If you're able to decouple people from those jobs and from those cities, it makes it much more possible to actually go back to, say, all these dried up areas, Main Street USA, all these more rural areas that have been completely decimated. And you'll have entrepreneurs starting up businesses there. And again, those businesses will have customers because everyone there will be getting the basic income. You'll just see a renaissance as far as small town USA goes, as long as it's flat.
Oh, you've convinced me, because I imagine in my head all these different variables and this more complicated equation, but you're right. How can political opposition to UBI be addressed?
Automation opens up this debate in a way that it just wouldn't otherwise. What are we doing worried about people not working if the problem we're trying to solve is that less people are able to work, And so if we're going for this future where people are losing their jobs, incomes are being reduced, and jobs are being transformed in a way that just increase insecurity in general, then there's definitely an argument that we should all actually benefit from this technology. Seeing this as a dividend that we have earned, we should also recognize that we all actually trained it. We're the ones who made it possible. All of our data.
You wrote the internet, yeah.
Right. The internet has been training these LLMs, the image models. Books from people long past, generations past, have been fed into these to train them. And so we should all recognize that because we all actually provided essentially the capital to make this possible, then we should see ourselves as stockholders that are owed a dividend for this. So it's not about asking what are the impacts on work or whatever. It's saying that we as capital owners, as stockholders, deserve a dividend from this technology that we all made possible.
What initially drew you to study UBI? What's the personal impact?
Yeah, so I got into this in 2013. And I actually got into it from the automation angle. And this was before really anyone was talking about automation to anywhere to the degree that we are now. And so I got into it. It was a discussion about how quickly technology was advancing. I know one was talking about it. That was on the front page of Reddit. That really got my attention. And as someone who considered myself to be informed about technology, I was surprised too about how a lot of these examples that people were sharing, that technology had advanced to the point that it had. And there was a recommendation for a book called Mana by Marshall Brain. I read that as a result, and I just thought it was fascinating how he visualized this future that seemed entirely possible, like Black Mirror episode where automation was going as far as the ability to. Mana was actually a name in the book for a software program that automated middle management. What happens if we actually automate all the managers and stuff first? This software fires people and hires people based on decisions and the data that it's analyzing, utilizing our existing welfare system. It then visualized, well, okay, most likely scenario is that we'll provide people food, we'll provide people housing, but we won't actually provide people a basic income. It's a very dystopian reality. The second half of the novel was about visualizing essentially what if you actually utilized this technology to actually make it better for everybody. And so you kind of create this Star Trek world inside of this utopian world just because of the different decisions that you're making. And I just thought that was really fascinating. And the author believed that basic income is the way to get to that Star Trek scenario versus the, let's call it the Hunger Games or the Mad Max scenario that we're currently still headed towards without making these important changes. And that got me looking into basic income as a concept. And I just think that if you're looking at a society that's a lot more intrinsically motivated, that's just a lot more purpose-filled society. And that's what I look forward to.
Good way to put it, yeah, purposeful society. And then, of course, you have your book, Let There Be Money, which people can pick up on Amazon right now. Talk about questions like what is money, how is it created, what's the point of taxes. So you're getting a good baseline for everything we talked about today. You should check out the book. Sure, you can check him out on Twitter. He got his full name up there, Scott Santens. You can see it on the screen, and feel free to, interact with him. All right, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, Scott.
Thanks for the invite. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this was really great. I'm glad Casey was able to connect us. That was exciting.